I will begin in the traditional way with the salutation of homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Good morning, everyone, and I welcome you to the first class in the series of talks on the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. And in order to investigate the fundamental teachings of Buddhism, we'll be going directly to the primary sources and basing our understanding, our explanation of the Buddha's teachings on these primary sources. The primary sources are organized in an anthology that I had compiled for Wisdom Publications some years ago, and this will serve as the fundamental textbook for the course. This is called In the Buddha's Words, and everybody who really wants to follow this course seriously should have a copy of this textbook. In this first class, I want to first give an overview of what I'll attempt to cover in the course, and then go into some of the background to the sources for the early teachings of the Buddha. Some years ago, when I was still living in Sri Lanka, Wisdom Publications asked me if I would compile an anthology of material from the sutras, because they were getting requests from professors in universities who wanted a source book of material from the sutras to use in their classes. And so I was thinking, how should I design such an anthology? And usually, when one is presented with the early Buddhist teachings, almost every book will use the Four Noble Truths as its framework. But if one actually looks at the sutras themselves, one sees that the Buddha doesn't immediately begin his teaching with the Four Noble Truths, but the Four Noble Truths come at a rather advanced stage in the Buddha's exposition of the teaching. And the Buddha generally will prepare his listeners for an understanding of the Four Noble Truths by gradually building up to layers of teaching until their minds have been opened up, made receptive to the teaching, until they are able to clear away their mental hindrances and gain trust and confidence in him. And then the Buddha will teach the Four Noble Truths. Also, if we look in the Sutta Pitaka itself, we see that the Buddha often gave discourses to lay people, dealing with different aspects of everyday life. And when we use the framework of the Four Noble Truths, there's almost no place to fit these teachings dealing with the application of Dhamma to everyday life. Because the structure of the Four Noble Truths is a structure of the teaching, a way of presenting the teaching aimed at liberation, at enlightenment and liberation. And yet the Buddha teaches Dhamma to those who are not yet prepared to make that strong effort to win liberation. And so the Buddha's teaching is presented to people at different levels in accordance with their conditions of life. And so when I was preparing this anthology, I wanted to use a framework which could accommodate these different aspects of the Buddha's teachings. And it occurred to me that the Pali commentaries sometimes use a scheme of what they call 3 types of benefit to which the Buddha's teaching is intended to lead. One of these is called, the first of these is called welfare and happiness here and now. Welfare and happiness in this present life. In Pali, this is Ita Dhamma, Sukha Ita. And within this category, we have the teachings that the Buddha gave to people on how to order their everyday lives, how to lead ethical lives, how to harmonize their family relationships, how to apply the teachings to their livelihood, how to establish peaceful and harmonious relationships within the community, within the society. Even guidelines that the Buddha gave to the kings and the republics on how to conduct the affairs of state in a way that would be a benefit to their citizens, to their communities. Okay, so this is one level of teaching. A second level of teaching arises out of the fact that, according to the Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching, this life is not the only life that we live, but this life is just, we call it one link in a chain of life. One link in a beginningless series of lives, each one beginning with birth and ending with death. And what ties these different lives together, what governs our movement from one existence to the next, is our karma. That is our volitional action. And so the Buddha's teaching is eventually aimed to lead to complete liberation from the cycle of rebirth. But of the many people that the Buddha taught, relatively few would be capable of achieving liberation within that very life that the Buddha was teaching them. So the Buddha would also teach quite extensively the guidelines and principles aimed at securing a fortunate or happy state of rebirth. These would be the teachings dealing extensively with karma, the nature of karma, the different types of karma that lead to the different realms of rebirth, and especially what are the good, wholesome, or meritorious types of karma that one should practice to achieve a fortunate or happy state of rebirth. And so we group all of the teachings that deal with this aspect of human life, we group all of these teachings together under the second category, which we call teachings dealing with welfare and happiness in future life. And that forms the second major category that I use for collecting the Buddha's teachings. Then the third category the third level of teaching is the teaching aimed at the state of ultimate liberation. Teaching aimed at the realization of nirvana, the attainment of enlightenment, and that these practices have expounded the practices leading to enlightenment. And so that forms the third major section of the book. And this will be like the third major division of this course. And then within that third major division, since it's quite extensive, I broke it up into several subcategories. First, a general treatment of the Buddha's path, kind of overview of the path. Then a chapter dealing in more detail with the methods of training the mind, cultivation of the mind. These are the methods that we call meditation. And then the next section deals with, since the aim of meditation is to gain insight into the nature of the way things are, the real nature of phenomena. The third section in this category deals with the understanding, the Buddha's understanding of the real nature of phenomena. What are the principles, the truth to be understood with wisdom, with insight. And then when these realizations of wisdom take place, then they lead to different levels of liberation. And so the final chapter of this section and of the whole book deals with these stages of liberation. Okay, the way I see this course organized, we'll have two sections. One will come this fall up through December. In this section, the preliminary section, we'll deal with primarily with the first two levels of the teaching. And then after the winter break that we have here at Huangyan Monastery, which is from January through March, then beginning in April, then I will start with the chapters dealing with the third level of the teaching, the chapters dealing with the Buddha's path to liberation. Okay, but before I came into this first level of teaching, in the book I put 3 preliminary chapters. One of these, the third, which we'll come to next week, takes an overview of the human condition as a kind of background to the Buddha's teaching, as to kind of look at the human condition through the lens of the Dhamma, the lens of the Buddha's teaching, to try to see how, from the perspective of the Buddha's enlightenment, human life appears, and what is it in human life that makes the appearance of a Buddha necessary? What is it that provides the field for a Buddha to appear and proclaim his doctrine, his Dhamma? The second preliminary chapter deals with the life of the Buddha. but dealing with the life of the Buddha not so much from the standpoint of biographical information, but rather seeing how the texts themselves treat the life of the Buddha as a kind of paradigm for the follower of the Buddha to model his or her own life. In a sense, we could say that the text used the life of the Buddha as I call it a spiritual paradigm for, call it, every person's spiritual quest. Well, of course, not everyone turns out to be the great spiritual teacher as the Buddha did. But we could see that the life of the Buddha is, in a sense, providing a series of lessons to his disciples on how one should live one's life in a way that best conforms to the model that the Buddha himself provided. And then the third preliminary chapter will deal with what I call approaching the Dhamma. That is, when one comes to the Buddha's teaching out of the blue, from a non-traditional background, how is one to relate to the teaching? Does one accept it all on faith as a religious package? Can one just pick and choose from the teaching what one likes? What role does questioning have in regard to the teaching? What role does faith have? What role does practice and realization have? Okay, I call this textbook In the Buddha's Words, and somehow this might give the impression that we have direct, immediate access to the Buddha's words. In fact, what I have to confess is that this wasn't the title that I gave to the book. I had, what did I title? I called it something like The Manifestation of Great Light. But then Wisdom Publication said, a title like that, nobody is going to know what the book is about. If they're looking through a catalog, Manifestation of Great Light, they won't have any idea what this book is about. And they wanted this book to become a very, very widely used source book on Buddha's teachings. And so they wanted to give it a title which would immediately suggest to somebody who is looking through a catalog or looking through a bookshop, what is the substance of this book? What is it dealing with? And so Wisdom Publication suggested this title. But the title seems to imply that we have direct access to the word of the Buddha just as he spoke it. But in the Buddha's day, there were no tape recorders. Not only no tape recorders, no pens and paper, no writing. So how do we know that we have anything that we can call the real word of the Buddha? And there are many, many texts which also come under the category of Buddha Vachana, word of the Buddha, ranging from different historical periods. The early schools, like the Theravada, say Abhidhamma Pitaka is spoken by the Buddha. Then the Mahayana Sutras say that they have been spoken by the Buddha. Then the Vajrayana Tantras don't claim quite that they were spoken by Gautama the Buddha in his physical body, but they say that they were spoken by the Buddha through a kind of transformation body. But how do we get back to the original sources of the Buddha? How do we know that we have anything that corresponds to the actual word of the Buddha? Did everybody get the handouts? It would have been three pages of handouts. I think 4 pages with the syllabus. Okay, now in the suttas themselves, when the Buddha is referring to the way his teachings have been organized, he refers to a 9-fold categorization of his teaching, so that he says that the teaching is being preserved in 9 forms, or it is called the 9-fold Dhamma. And I've listed these here on what the sheet called sources for the earliest Buddhist teachings. And so one of these is called sutta, which in this 9-fold scheme means only discourses that are preserved in prose. Then we have other categories, gaya, which are discourses in mixed prose and verse, Vyakarana, which are explanations given by the Buddha or sometimes one of his disciples as answers to questions. Then Gatha, these are texts preserved entirely in verse, such as the Therigatha, with the Dhammapada, parts of the Sutta Nipata, then several other categories, which you can read for yourself here. But the scheme for classifying the Buddha's teachings that we have now, and that we've had ever since perhaps the beginning, at least the beginning of the Christian era, probably several centuries earlier, is very different from this scheme. At a very early point, probably even soon after the passing away of the Buddha, this 9-fold scheme for organizing the Buddha's teachings was replaced by a different scheme. And that is the scheme through which the Buddha's teachings have come down through the centuries. This scheme organizes the Buddha's teachings into what we call pitaka. The word pitaka originally meant a basket. But I think this term is being used metaphorically to suggest the idea that different teachings were, in a sense, grouped together to form different compilations according to their basic subject matter or basic approach. So in the very earliest period, there would have been only 2 baskets of the teaching. That is the Vinaya Pitaka, which is the compilation of rules and regulations governing the monastic order, and then the Sutta Pitaka, the collection of the Buddha's discourses. And over time, we have built up another collection, a more philosophical collection, which was called the Abhidhamma Pitaka. And so this gives us the traditional Tripitaka, or 3 baskets of the teaching. So the word T means 3, and Pitaka means basket. So these are the 3 baskets or 3 compilations of the teachings. Then of these three baskets, the one that's most important for our study of the Buddha's teaching is the Sutta Pitaka. The Sutta Pitaka is in turn broken down into several divisions, and these divisions are called, in the Theravada or Pali tradition, they're called Nikayas. But other early Buddhist schools use the word agama for these divisions of the Sutta Pitaka. And even the Pali commentaries refer to the Nikayas also as agamas. So it seems that in early period, even the Pali tradition used the word agamas as well as Nikayas for these divisions of the Sutta Pitaka. And now the Theravada tradition believes that the Sutta Pitaka, which is preserved in Pali, the Pali language, is the collection which preserves, the one collection that preserves the authentic, most ancient teachings of the Buddha. And this belief is still very strong in the tradition, but it's no longer defensible. And why is this so? Because early Buddhism in India divided into a number of schools. And all of these schools have preserved a collection of the early Buddhist teachings, divided into agamas or nikayas. Unfortunately, because of the destruction of Buddhism in India, the texts of almost all of these schools were obliterated and lost forever. However, fortunately, in an early period, the Buddhist missionaries from India and Central Asia went to China. And in China, they translated several of these agamas from different Buddhist schools into the Chinese language. The Chinese language that was used at that time. This would have been a fairly early period, perhaps 3rd, 4th, 5th century. And so we have in Chinese counterparts to each of the Pali Nikayas, but coming not from one school, but from different Buddhist schools. I will come to this in a little while. And then, in more recent years, excavations took place in Turkestan, Chinese Turkestan, excavations which turned up unexpectedly, almost miraculously, old manuscripts preserved under the sands of the desert for centuries, old manuscripts of Buddhist texts written in Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, a form of Sanskrit. It was especially modified for use in Buddhist literature. And these fragments corresponded to parts of the Pali Nikaya. And so one could compare them and see that these other Buddha schools did indeed have texts comparable to the Pali Nikaya. And then occasionally, on the antiques market, a vase would turn up with a scroll inside in birchwood coming from Afghanistan, which would have, once that piece of parchment would be sent to the experts for examination and identification, it would be found that these pieces of parchment were transcriptions, recordings of Buddhist texts that corresponded, that belonged to another early Buddhist school. And these pieces of parchment, what they preserved, these texts, were texts that corresponded to texts in the Pali Canon. I think everybody, all of you know of the Dhammapada, one of the most popular Buddhist texts. In the early 20th century, fragments, pieces of parchment, turned up. I think that they were found in a vase that was on the antiques market. And these fragments, pieces of parchment, were sent to the experts. They were actually broken up, those pieces of parchment, probably by the people who discovered it, and sent in different directions. But at roughly the same time, they were found, identified, and put together. And it was found that this was a recording of a Dhammapada in another language, another script. It was a language used in the state or the country of Gandhara. It's northwest of India. Gandhara now corresponds to Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. The script that was used is similar to Hebrew. It belongs to that family of scripts rather than similar to Sanskrit script. But the manuscript itself was a transcription of a version of the Dhammapada closely related to the Pali Dhammapada, but different from it, different in language. The language is what has been identified as the Gandhari language, a language used in northwest India. The order of verses is somewhat different, but these verses have been compiled in a book and put in one column with the verses of the Pali Dhammapada in another column. And if one is able to read Pali, one can look at this other language, which is a little bit strange, but one could read through it and understand it. That it is indeed a Dhammapada very close to the Pali Dhammapada. But it has been developing in a very different part of the world, whereas the Pali Dhammapada had been propagated, had been transmitted in southern Asia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma. This Gandhari Dhammapada was being transmitted in the northwest of India, in what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan. And yet the texts are very similar. Then, In the 1930s, there was an Indian explorer, his name was Rahul Sankrityayan. He went to Tibet, and in the Tibetan monastery, he found an Indian manuscript which had been there for centuries. Because Tibet is a very dry country, so these old Indian parchment manuscripts could be preserved without deterioration. And he took photographs of this manuscript. He was a good Pali and Sanskrit scholar, Rahul Sankrityayan. So when he looked at it, he must have been able to read it through that script, Indian script, and knew that this was a version of the Dhammapada. So he took photographs of this and brought it back to India for study by the specialists. And this has turned out to be a text which is now called the Patna Dhammapada, because the original photographs are now preserved in the city of Patna. And so we have here 3 Dhammapadas preserved in Indian languages, which are just slight variations of one another. Pali, a Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, that's the language of the Patna Dhammapada, and Kandari, the language of that Dhammapada that must have originated from Afghanistan. Okay, then in the 20th century, scholars also began to study the Chinese Tripitaka, the agamas in the Chinese Tripitaka. And as they studied the agamas in the Chinese Tripitaka, they found that these agamas have sutras which correspond closely to the sutras in the Pali Tripitaka. What's interesting is that the arrangement of the 2 collections are quite different. We have to remember, firstly, this is an important point, the Pali Nikayas all come from one school. This is the school we call the Theravada school. But the Chinese Tripitaka, in the Chinese Tripitaka, the agamas come from probably 3 or 4 different schools. If you look on the sheet that I gave you, page number 1, in the Chinese Tripitaka towards the bottom, the Chinese Tripitaka, we have a Dirghagama. This is the counterpart of the Digha Nikaya, a collection of long discourses. And this comes from the Dharmaguptaka school. That's the school that flourished in northwest India. Or I should say, that flourished northwest of India. And then it has the Madhyama Agama, the counterpart of the Pali Madhyama Nikaya, which came from another school, which is our Bhaktivada school. And then a Samyukta Agama, the counterpart of the Samyukta Nikaya. It's a counterpart of SA, it should be counterpart of SN. This is also from the Sarvastivada, but it seems from a different branch than the one that gives us the Madhyama Agama. And then going on to page 2, the Chinese Tripitaka also has, in the 4th place, in a Kotara Agama. This is a counterpart of the Pali Anguttara Nikaya. And most scholars think that this collection comes from the Mahasangikas So some scholars, including A.K. Warder, author of a book on Indian Buddhism, think this might come from the Dharma-Guptaka. You don't have to worry about these different schools. The important point is that the 4 collections in the Chinese Tipitaka don't come from the same source, but from different sources. But when we compare the 4 Agamas with the 4 Nikayas, we find difference of arrangement. So a sutta that might be in the Pali Majjhima Nikaya, in the Chinese Tipitaka, might be in the Ekottara Agama. And conversely, a sutta that is in the Pali Anguttara Nikaya might be in the Pali Majjhima Nikaya. And so this suggests that the idea that these 4 Nikayas were fixed at a very early period is not acceptable. More likely, what is more likely to have been the case is that the 4 methods of division, the 4 means of compiling suttas are used as general categories in all the Buddha schools. But each Buddha school, over time, made its own decisions about which suttas to classify in which category. And so this comparison of the different collections forces us to change our understanding of the formation of the early Buddhist canon. If one looks at the section in the Pali Canon and the Pali commentaries which describe the first Buddhist council, according to these accounts, at the first council, the Sangha met together and established the form of the canon exactly as we have it, pretty much as we have it today. They set up the 4 categories of the Nikayas, and then they assigned each sutta to its place within the scheme of the Nikayas. And then from then on, this compilation was preserved from generation to generation. That is what I call the legend or myth of the first Buddhist council. But when we compare the different accounts when we compare the different collections and see how they all use basically the same scheme, but have assigned different sutras to different places within that scheme, then we have to arrive at a different way of understanding the process of text formation in early Buddhism. It seems that rather that the compilations developed organically over a period of time, maybe about 100 years. So probably at the first council, we could say that a basic scheme for classifying the text was devised. Probably the scheme of the 4 Nikayas, the 4 Agamas. And probably the most important sutras, or most distinctive sutras in each category, were assigned to their place within the scheme of 4 Agamas or 4 Nikayas. But there would have been other sutras which were not so clearly assignable to one category or another. And as time went on, within the different schools or different lines of transmission, these sutras came to be classified differently in different nikayas, different arguments. And how did these texts come down to us to the present day? As I mentioned earlier, the Buddha didn't write anything down. And at the first council, also, monks didn't write anything down. In those days, it was considered almost sacrilegious to write down religious texts. If writing was used at all, it was used for business, or for the king issuing royal proclamations. But the Brahmins who specialized in the Vedas always transmitted their literature from one generation to the next by memory, by oral transmission and by memory. And so young Brahmin boys from the age of 12 would be trained to memorize the Vedas. So when they reached maturity, then they would choose their pupils from the age of 12 and train them to memorize the Vedas. And so when the Buddha came on the scene and began his teaching, his discourses were to be preserved in the same way, that is, through memorization and oral transmission. One of the Buddha's personal disciples, whose name was Ananda, he was functioning almost like the Buddha's personal attendant, personal secretary, was reputed to have an extraordinary memory. And so he was able to remember many of the discourses of the Buddha. And he played a very major role at the first council. And other monks too would train their minds to remember the discourses and to teach them to their own disciples. Now, after the passing away of the Buddha and after the first council, a great number of discourses and material was established for the purpose of transmission. Probably at the first council, this material was edited and streamlined in order to make it easier to transmit. So a certain degree of standardization was used. This is why the texts have very standardized formulas. But how was any individual to remember such a mass of material? Now we have the Pali Canon, 40-something volumes. Who is going to remember all of this? There are some monks who can remember that amount of material. In Burma in recent times, even today, there are some who can memorize the entire Pali Tripitaka. But it was not a very reliable method of transmission to expect everybody to remember everything. But the Sangha would have found a more effective method of transmission to lie in dividing communities of monks into what they call companies of transmitters. The word here is Bhanakas. On page 2 I have that word in Pali, Bhanaka. The word Bhanaka means a reciter. And so they would take this massive material, divide it into different collections, and so different groups of monks would specialize in memorization of different collections. So there would be the Digam Bhanakas, those who specialize in the memorization of the Diga Nikaya, the long collection. Majjhima Brahmakas, those who specialize in the middle-length collection, and so on. So each collection had its own Brahmakas, its own reciters. And in this way, over hundreds of years, the teachings were transmitted from one generation to the next. When Buddhism came from India to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BC, still the texts were not put down in writing. But the Indian missionaries who came to Sri Lanka taught them orally to their Sri Lankan disciples, and then their Sri Lankan disciples would again learn by memory and transmit them orally to their own disciples. So in this way, the teachings went on for about 400 years by oral transmission, until in the 1st century BC, in Sri Lanka, there was an epidemic when large numbers of monks who specialized in memorization died. There were wars, and so there was a fear that certain texts could be lost because of these dangers to life. And so at that point, the Sangha met together and decided that it's too risky to use this method of oral transmission. We have to preserve the text in writing. Probably there would have been conservative elders who shook their heads and said, now the Dhamma is about to die out. Just like today when the older monks see the younger ones using computers, they say, oh, now the Dhamma is about to die out. Okay, so it's my own opinion that the canon that has come down to us today probably received its final form only when it was set down in writing. But this is my own hypothesis. During the period of oral transmission, texts that were in one collection might have been moved over to another collection, texts from another collection could have been shifted into still another collection. So there was a lot of room for movement of text from one collection to another. Perhaps even there were different formulations of text up to the time when the text was set in writing. From that point on, they were given their final form, their final stamp. And the same process would have gone on in the other schools, which had their own lines of oral transmission. And so for this reason, the texts that are set down in the other schools have different schemes of organization. But what is interesting, though, the schemes of organization are different. When one compares a text preserved in Chinese translation translated from an Indian language into Chinese in, say, the 4th century, preserved for hundreds of years in Chinese, with the text preserved in Sri Lanka or Burma for hundreds of years in Pali. If one knows the languages, one could see that the words of the text themselves are sometimes so exactly close that it's remarkable. While staying in Chinese monasteries, I managed to pick up in an amateurish way a little bit Chinese. So I put, using the computer, the Chinese version of the sutta on one part of the screen, the Pali version on the other part of the screen, and sometimes I can go through and compare them and find that the Chinese version, the Pali version, almost whole blocks of text, word for word identical, almost as though the Chinese was translated from the Pali, but it was not. It was translated from another Indian language, like Prakrit or Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. But the formulations had obviously been set down in fixed wordings, and then preserved and transmitted in these different schools. And then the translators into Chinese would have been adhering very closely to the wording of the original Indian text, so that an ordinary Chinese person today, even somebody with, say, a PhD in engineering, business, a degree in business management, looks at one of the Chinese Buddhist texts, they can identify almost every character, but they can't understand what the text is saying at all. Because the vocabulary is trying to imitate an Indian Buddhist text. Sometimes the sentence structure is trying to imitate the sentence structure of an Indian Buddhist text. But somebody who knows almost no Chinese just how to figure out a few characters, but who knows Pali, like myself, can pick up the language of these early Buddhist texts in Chinese just by comparing one with the other. Okay, but now, even though there's such great similarity between these collections, but still, I say that the Pali Nikayas have special importance for us. And I say this for 4 reasons. One, which I already mentioned, is that they all belong to a single school. And so for this reason, they have a certain, we call it consistency of style, consistency of formulation. The second reason is that they are preserved in a language which is closely related to the language or the languages that the Buddha himself must have used. This is the language that we call Pali. The word Pali itself is not the original name for this language, but the word Pali arose as something of a mistake. The word Pali originally means line, and it was used by the commentaries to designate the canonical text as opposed to the commentary on the text. And so the commentaries call the canonical text Pali, and the commentary Epthakatha, the explanation of the meaning. Then the commentaries speak about the language of the canonical text as Pali Bhasa, which means canonical language. But then somebody would have seen this expression, Pali Bhasa, and it's similar in structure to, say, Sinhala Bhasa is singular language, or you could say China Bhasa, Chinese language. I think it's Ingi Bhasa, would be English language. And so seeing Pali Bhasa, this could have been European scholars, but Pali language, the name of the language is Pali. And so they began to call this language of the text Pali. The Theravadins, traditional Theravadins, take Pali, or this language of the text, to be the language that the Buddha himself used. But this opinion or this view is not accepted by contemporary linguistic scholars. Contemporary linguistic scholars hold that the language that the Buddha used, or the languages, would have been languages used in the eastern part of India, where the Buddha taught in northeast India. And Pali is a North Indian language, but it has features more distinctive of Western India. And so the hypothesis is that Pali, what we call Pali, is actually a hybrid language, a language created somewhat artificially by taking features from several North Indian languages to create a language that would have been understandable by monks in different parts of northern India. But even though what we call Pali might not have been the language that the Buddha himself used, but it is very similar to such a language in vocabulary and in structure. So, to say the vocabulary of this language takes us to the thought world of the Buddha, the kind of conceptual framework in which he would have been operating. Whereas when we use translations, whether it's in English, Chinese, Tibetan, we're always taking words from other highly developed languages with their own auras of meaning, with their own reverberations that might be quite different from that of the original text. This is a problem that every translator from Pali has to face. How does one deal with the implications of this word that are lost when one translates this into English, and then the English word brings along other implications that one doesn't want to bring along. Okay, so this is the second reason for the importance of the Pali Nikayas. The third reason is that these Pali Nikayas still serve as an authority for a living Buddhist school. That is, for the Theravada Buddhist school, which for centuries has prevailed in southern Asia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and now has an increasing number of followers in the West. Whereas texts like the Agamas come from schools which are completely extinct. And then a fourth reason for the value of the Pali Nikayas is simply that English translations of them are widely available. So for those who are not going to learn these languages, the different traditions, and don't have the time and inclination to try to penetrate these difficult languages, there are many translations from the Pali available. So this can take us into the world of early Buddhism without challenging us to overcome this linguistic gap. Okay, I wanted to leave time now for questions. So, if anybody has questions, please feel welcome to ask. And there should be a microphone that could be passed around. Okay, the question whether there's a particular translation of the Dhammapada that I would recommend. I think maybe it would be useful to have several translations. For a very literal, scholarly translation, there's one by K.R. Norman, published by the Pali Text Society. He also translates the title, so it might be called something Buddha's Words, something like this. What I find very useful about K.R. Norman's translations, his translation itself is usually rather flat and, say, bloodless. But since I studied Pali, and K.R. Norman is he was formerly the president of the Pali Text Society, I find his notes very interesting. So usually I go for his translations not so much because I like his translation, but because I like to read his notes. So his translation is usually very accurate in terms of adhering very closely to the precise meaning of the Pali text. But then to balance that out with one that might be more inspiring, there's one I know from Kilo Donsdale. This is published by Shambhala. I think it's by Shambhala. It's good. And there should be one on the internet by Venerable Tanisaro Uku. That one would also be good. Then there's one by Acharya Buddharakita, published by the Buddhist Publication Society. I've written the preface to that. That one I also like. So I would recommend those. I remember that years ago there was one that was published by Shambhala. I think it's off the market now, which is fortunate. I don't remember the translator, but it was a very bad translation. It was very free and very bad, but it was becoming the popular translation in the USA, which everybody was quoting, which I thought was unfortunate. Because it was too free, so it gave many wrong, it had sometimes only the slenderest relationship to the original meaning of the text. And then I think there was a Penguin translation, Juan Mascaro translation of the Dhammapada, also misleading. And then I think Oxford University Press had a translation by Radha Krishna, Indian scholar, which was also misleading. Because the Indian translators will want to translate the Dhammapada through the lens of traditional Indian thought, especially Hindu or Vedantic thought, rather than taking the Buddha as a teacher who was not falling in line with the Vedantic or Vedic tradition. So I think these, if you take K.R. Norman for scholarly precision, Joe Fronsdale and Venerable Tanisaro Bhikkhu, you'll get, looking at all of them, and you can get a good picture of the Dhammapada. Yes?
During Buddha's life and his teaching, giving lectures and everything, was there people already memorizing these lectures? And how long after his death was the first council?
Okay, the question is, during the Buddha's lifetime, were there people already memorizing his teaching? And then how long after his death did the first council take place? It appears to be quite evident that during the Buddha's time, there were people already memorizing his teachings. Like one of the qualities that the Buddha mentions as an outstanding quality of a disciple, especially a monk disciple, is that he's one who has heard much, listened to many teachings, and bears them in mind. Bears them in mind means store them up in memory. Okay, this is mentioned as a general characteristic of a disciple. Then there would have been people who memorized his teachings. Because one hears that sometimes a monk would come to visit the Buddha, and then the Buddha would say, please recite some Dhamma for me. And then that monk would recite a particular collection of verses that the Buddha had spoken on an occasion. And then the Buddha would praise that monk. So there would have been definitely monks who were memorizing the teachings. And then it said that the Venerable Ananda, when he was serving as the Buddha's attendant, would memorize all the teachings that he heard from the Buddha, and whenever teachings were spoken in his absence, he would always request that later they be reported to him, and he would then memorize them. Okay, then the first council, according to the account given in the sources, the Vinaya-Pitaka, Srila Bhagavad, the Buddha had said passed away. This is according to the Theravada tradition, in May, though my personal belief is that indications that his passing away didn't take place in May, but rather in February. In February. Well, I could be branded a heretic for that idea. But it said that the monks came together to meet, to rehearse his teaching during the first rainy season after his passing away. The rainy season takes place right after the full moon of July. It's a 3-month period from full moon of July to the full moon of October. And so, if the Buddha passed away in May, it would have been 3 months. If he passed away in February, about 6-7 months. I think about 6-7 months after he passed away.
What is the relationship between the 4 Nikayas in the Pali Canon and how you organize the book in terms of happiness in this life, happiness in future life, consideration?
Okay.
And the 6 schemes of the rearrangement of sutras also allow for you to make that arrangement?
Okay. The question is, what is the relationship between the organization scheme of the Nikayas or Agamas and the particular pattern that I use for this book, using the structure of the 3 types of benefits? Before I come to that, we have to deal with the question, what is the organizing scheme of the Nikayas themselves? And what's interesting is that explicitly the Nikayas don't have any apparent organizing scheme by way of subject matter. If you go back to page 1 of the handout, where I have the section 3a on the Pali Canon, here we have the Digha Nikaya, which is the collection of long discourses. It's a collection of 34 sutras, and these are grouped together simply on the basis of their length. Sometimes there's a certain similarity between sutras that will follow one another. They might have a certain theme connecting them together. But there's no progressive, let's say there's no progressive principle underlying their grouping together. The Majjhima Nikaya, the collection of middle-length discourses, is 152 sutras, which are grouped together simply because they're roughly of middle length. These sutras are divided into different chapters, and to some extent there'll be some principle that might unite different chapters. For example, the sutras that go into one chapter might all make use of similes. So this will be the chapter of similes. But all that unites them is that they all center around a simile. Another chapter might be the chapter of analysis, in that all the sutras in this chapter might make use of a more detailed analysis than other chapters. Another chapter might be the chapter spoken to householders. Again, nothing more that unites them, but they're spoken to householders. Another, the chapter on wanderers, that they're spoken to wanderers from other sects. I'm going to pass over to Samyutta Nikaya. The Anguttara Nikaya, what's called the numerically expanding discourses, is arranged according to a numerical scheme. Now you see, when the Buddha was speaking, in order to make the teachings easy to remember, he would often expound the teachings according to the number of items they involve. So sometimes he would say, now there are 3 things that should be eliminated. What are these 3 things? Greed, hatred, and ignorance. And he'll elaborate. Or there are 4 qualities that a monk should acquire which makes him worthy of veneration, worthy of offering, worthy of hospitality. What are these four things? And he'll explain. And so in this way we get many teachings which are framed around fixed numbers of items. And the Anguttara Nikaya organizes these teachings numerically. So we have 11 chapters in this collection, grouped as the chapter of ones, chapter of twos, chapter of threes, chapter of fours, all the way up to the last chapter, the chapter of 11, which maybe was added almost as an afterthought, since it seems originally, the original idea was to have a framework of 10 chapters, ending with a chapter of 10. But then for some reason, they wanted to include a few other sutras, which used 11 items. So then they added this very short last chapter, the chapter of 11. Now the Samyutta Nikaya is a little bit different, because this collection groups together sutras according to subject matter. So the main chapters of the Samyutta Nikaya are concerned with the topic of which they're concerned, and each chapter will collect a large number of short sutras dealing with that subject matter. For example, the Buddha often spoke about the 5 aggregates. And so many of these short sutras dealing with the 5 aggregates will come together in one chapter, the chapter on the aggregates. Often he spoke about the 6 sense bases. So many chapters come together, or many sutras come together in the chapter on the 6 sense bases. He often spoke about dependent origination. Many short sutras on dependent origination come together in one chapter, the chapter on dependent origination. Similarly, the Noble Eightfold Path, many short sutras group in a chapter on the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, so when I organized the scheme for this book regarding the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, and Anguttara Nikaya, there was no pre-established scheme in those Nikayas for me to follow, but I took whatever sutras are found in those collections that fit under the particular category and grouped them there. The chapters in the Samyutta Nikaya I found particularly useful for dealing with the chapter called Shining the Light of Wisdom, and the section in that chapter dealing with the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the different elements, dependent origination, the 4 noble truths. Since there we already find chapters dealing with those topics. Okay, is there any further questions? Okay, if there's no further questions, then we'll end for the morning. Okay, we end by doing, I recite some verses in Pali for the sharing of the merit. When we speak the Dhamma and listen to the Dhamma, discuss the Dhamma, then we acquire some wholesome, meritorious karma, which we then want to share and to share with others. And we do this by inviting the devas or deities, the nagas or dragon spirits and other beings to rejoice in these merits and to protect the true Dhamma, to protect the exposition or teaching of the Dhamma, and to protect the world from harm and suffering. Okay, I'll recite these verses in Pali. You can join the hands and then listen with a mind of loving kindness sharing in your own heart the merits with others. You could think of any departed relatives or anybody you know in any problematic situation and wish them to benefit from the blessing power of our Dhamma discussion today. Devanagamasidikha Pranācamanumodikva Chiram Vakantu Sāsanam Atāsataca Bhumata Devanagamasidikha Pranācamanumodikva Chiram Vakantu Desanam Atāsataca Bhumata Devanagamasidikha Pranācamanumodikva Chiram Vakantu Desanam Etavata Amhehi Sampadam Punyam Sampadam Sadhe Deva Anumodantu Sabha Sampati Siddhya Etavata Amhehi Sampadam Punyam Sampadam Sabhe Bhutta Anumodantu Sabha Sampati Siddhya Etavata Amhehi Sampadam Punyam Sampadam Sabhe Bhutta Anumodantu Sabha Sampati Siddhya Parādhāya Adhisidetato Ekantare Satasai Utapana Rudya Rudisha Patanya Samlino Dukha Samusantu Putantu Me Bhukti. Okay, so next week we will meet again at 9:30, and next week we will deal with the first chapter in the book, in the Buddha's Word. Oh, right. Okay, good that you made that announcement. We meet again in 2 weeks. That's right. That's September 29th, and we will deal with the chapter called The Human Condition as the background for the Buddha's message. And I suggest to read the chapter in advance of the class. And if you have questions, never feel hesitant about asking them. Even writing questions that come up when you do your reading in advance.